Hello and welcome back to my shop. My name is George and I'm coming to you from Chelsea, Quebec. Today's video is about, well, one of you. Keith Clegg wrote me a lovely comment a long time ago following a video that I had made about a thin strip ripping gauge. And he caught my interest right away by mentioning that he had built a version of that ripping jig and had just cut 1,400 feet of 3/16 inch thick strips with it. And I took that to be an incredible endorsement of the utility of that way of ripping strips. So let me say a little bit more about what he wrote and what he's done, and I'll include some photographs of the project that he's onto. He's building a kayak, and he's using those strips to form the skin of the kayak. So let me turn to some photographs and tell you a little bit more about it.
So it caught my attention right away that Keith had processed 1,400 feet of strips. But it went beyond that. He needed long strips for a kayak, and so his boards were often 10 and 12 feet in length. I had used 3 and 4 foot lengths in the past, so it was very reassuring to hear that even a long length would work well in the jig. His material was largely a random source, and that makes so much sense to me. If you need small, thin strips, you can harvest it from found materials. Many of the boards that he used were in the mahogany family, so largely sapele. And of course, that makes a lot of sense for a watercraft. Now, I said that it goes beyond that, and it really does, because he also made modifications to the jig that I think everybody should know about. One was by way of safety, and another one was to get better performance. And along the way, through some correspondence that Keith and I had, I learned even more about his project. I got progress pictures of how he's been doing. I'll be showing them to you. And woodworking tips, not just for building a kayak, but tips that are of general application. So stay tuned for those. And of course, there was the unwanted manicure, as he called it. So in the course of doing this work, he nicked a fingernail and the tip of his finger, and he described what happened. It looked like it was a convergence of many factors. Now, I don't want to color his words with my interpretation of what happened, so what I'll do is simply reprint what he wrote in the show notes. Read it for yourself, because this is information that you can use to decide whether this kind of jig is safe or not. Okay, so we just got a good picture of the materials that went into making the strips. Here are 3 more photos that show the strips themselves. It might be a little bit hard to see the divisions between the strips, and that's because Keith bound them up according to where they came from. So each board was had its strips bound together, and then the strips were bound exactly in the order and the orientation in which they came off. Now, why that's important, it leads to a couple of advantages, and I will mention what they are a little bit later when we get a good picture of what the kayak is starting to look like. Here's a view of Keith's jig. Keith says that he doesn't have slots, miter slots on his table saw, so he fixes the position using cleats and clamps. The rest of it looks pretty much the same as the one that you've seen in my earlier video. So at the entry side of things, we've got the half fence. Positioned on the half fence is the first of Keith's modifications, and that's the feather board. That looks like a really useful thing to add, to have a feather board holding the work down as you feed it. Right after, so just to the left of the feather board would be the blade. Of course, this is just the jig. No, there's no table saw in the picture. And what's been added there is a polycarbonate cover over top of the blade. So this is an L-shaped cover that goes over the top and down the outside. Um, it doesn't obstruct your view at all, but it does obstruct your touch. So that's a really good addition, I think. And then after that is the wedge itself. I think Keith also made it out of polycarbonate, so it might be a little tricky to make out in this photograph. Um, so there's the feather board, which is shown in the second photograph. And moving on, we also get a close-up of the L-shaped safety cover that goes over the blade. Now, another modification, this one now doesn't go to safety so much as it goes to performance, are these horizontal slots that you see at the mounting bolts. And they let you move the fence either a little bit closer to the blade or a little bit farther away. So depending on the height of the blade, you can adjust the gap and make it as small as possible. Um, this is intended to reduce the chatter or the vibration that you'll get at the end of a cut. And then finally, we've got one view of the jig, but this is now from the other side. So the side that has the fixed, immovable block of wood, along with the cards that are used to adjust the width of the cut. The shape of the kayak is determined by these forms, so the strips will be glued to each other one at a time, but not to the forms. And the design came from Nick Shade of Guillemot Kayaks. This is a resource for do-it-yourselfers who want to put together either a kayak or a canoe. There's a few different designs of each available. Um, Nick himself comes recommended not only for the resources that he provides on that website, but also for the guidance that he gives while you're building your kayak or canoe. So that's a site that's well worth visiting if you're interested in building one of these watercrafts. Even though Keith was working with boards that were 10 and 12 feet in length, that still wasn't enough for some of the strips that he needed for his kayak. And so for that, he needed to make some scarf joints. And in order to do that, he needed a place in the house where he had the length to work with. At this point, I would like to toast our spouses who understand that sometimes the shop needs to extend to other parts of the house in order to get the job done. So earlier I said there were a couple of good reasons for keeping the strips in order, and here they are. The first one is aesthetics, and you can see it in this photograph. These strips have been slip matched. In other words, let's say the top one goes to the right of the second one, and then those two go to the right of the third one, and so forth. None of them are flipped over. When you do it that way, you'll see a repeating pattern in the strips. In this case, it looks like waves, and what could be more appropriate than a pattern of waves on the side of a kayak? So that's the aesthetic reason for keeping the strips in order. But there's also a working reason for keeping them in order. Think back to book matching now, for example. So let's say you resaw a thick panel, you open it up like a book, and then glue those two together. Well, if the grain is emerging, let's say on the right side, it'll be diving into the wood on the left side. So when you start planing around the junction, around the joint, on one side it'll be smooth planing, on the other side you're going to be risking tear out. With slip matching, that's not as much of a problem because the grain will be emerging one strip after another, after another, after another, or it'll be diving in each of the successive strips. Um, but the point is, it'll be going more or less in the same direction, and that makes the planing um, closer to being a joy than to misery. So, two good reasons for keeping the things in order. Number one, what it ends up looking like, and number two, making your life a little bit less miserable as a woodworker. So, with this last group of three photos, we're celebrating the installation of the whiskey strip. The whiskey strip is the last one to go in when you finish the bottom, and it entitles you to a glass of whiskey. And I guess since there's a left and a right to this, there are actually two whiskey strips, so naturally that would be two glasses of whiskey. I can't get over how beautiful this build is shaping up to be. It's not overly ornate. We're just letting, well, Keith is just letting the beauty of the wood show through. A lot of the craftsmanship shows through with the placement of those two parallel, thin, light colored strips. I guess those were the pine. Um, just uh, elegance. It's gorgeous. Now, I do want to tell you about a couple of general purpose tips. Now, these are not peculiar to building a kayak, they're generally useful. So, these are two tips that Keith passed on along the way. One of them is if you're using yellow glue, then heat will soften it. So, if it happens that you place the board, or in this case a strip, um, and in the course of curing it moved or the glue joint is wonky, it needs to be redone because it's too proud on one side and too much recessed on the other. Well, you can take heat from a heat gun, warm the thing up, and the glue will soften and let go. And so then you get an easy redo. You don't have to start rebuilding the canoe from scratch. You can just remove and replace the one strip that's offending. The second tip has to do with shaping. So you can imagine that if the strip is shaped ahead of time, not just with planing, but also with bending, it will conform to where it needs to be more easily. And a really simple way to bend these strips is again with heat, just dry heat, not steam bending, but you just take a heat gun to it. The binding element that keeps the wood cells together will relax, it'll let go, and then you can shape the wood, you can bend it roughly to the shape that you need, let it cool down, and it'll keep that shape. So two interesting things that you can do with heat. One is you can get a redo to a glued joint, and the other one is you can prepare a bent shape to a piece of wood by applying heat. Keith, thank you so much for your input, for vouching for the jig, for making modifications to it, for inviting us in to get a glimpse of your build, the progress that you're making on it, the woodworking tips. It's just been a rich correspondence, and I'm looking forward to further updates on how things go. And as I get them, I will be supplementing this series along the way. So let's leave the static pictures for now and return to the moving picture show.
Thank you so much for staying it through till here. Remember what we always say, uh, make some time for your passion, and if you can share it, even better. Bye from me for now.